Well, let's go back to the first piece of legislation, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. And if people remember the furore around that, much of that was about the police introducing new powers because of noise and the ability to be able to restrict protests because they were too noisy. What's interesting is that power has not been used in the year since the Act was introduced. The other thing that was in there was this change that the police insisted was necessary so that people could be arrested because they ought to have known a restriction had been imposed on a protest. That has also not been used. And both that and noise were fought for really hard by the Conservative government and justified by police officers, and yet they haven't been used. And there's a reason for that. Partly because the intention was to prepare the police for the future, just to give them essentially a rack of different powers that they might potentially be able to use in the future. But also because, as it turned out, they weren't the most important parts of that act, and that's only really become clear since the introduction of that new legislation, right? So that's what it turns out is the most important parts of the act were the ability of the Home Secretary, without reference to Parliament, to define the different ways that protests may have a serious disruption to the life of the community. That's one thing. And the second thing was the introduction of a power that was never really intended to be used just for protest, but clearly has been, and that's public nuisance. So we jump forward to the Public Order Act, and the issue around serious disruption suddenly becomes clearer, right? So one of the first things that happens on the introduction of that new legislation is that Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, says, I'm going to define serious disruption to mean anything beyond a minor hindrance. Despite the fact, if you remember, some of you people will remember that that was specifically rejected by the House of Lords. Now there was a whole load of, hoo-ha about how terrible this was, but that's not really gone anywhere. But the situation we find ourselves in now is essentially you've got two steps. You've got minor hindrance, and then you've got serious disruption, and no middle ground between the two. Of course, what that means is the police have got enormous scope to be able to interpret where that dividing line is crossed. Clearly, if you think about a demonstration, let's say, in the middle of Manchester, 20,000 people marching in Manchester, that causes more disruption than two people locked on outside of the entrance to an office. But the likelihood is, because the first one is seen as being an acceptable protest and the second one is seen as being a disruptive protest, that it's the two people who cause far less, quotes, disruption to the life of the community by their action, who will be the ones who will be arrested and prosecuted. And so what it means, of course, is that certain movements become the greater targets for the use of these powers. And environmental movements, Just Stop Oil in particular, and that's driven by politics. So November last year, the Home Secretary spoke to a partnership summit that was held in Westminster, organised by the National Police Chiefs Council, and said that there was an institutional reluctance by the police to deal with Just Stop Oil. And so what we've seen subsequent to that, obviously, is a stepping up of direct interventions in Just Stop Oil protests. So over the course of the period from the beginning of May up until now, there's been something like just under 300 times when Section 12 powers have been used to restrict people from stepping into the road and immediately forcing them out. Now, in most cases, there's not an offence clause there, but you have to wonder why it is that the police get so excited about those type of protests, and it's because they've got political pressure being applied to them. As I said, the other thing is public nuisance. Ironically, public nuisance was always something that was used against corporations that were responsible for, pumping waste into rivers and stuff like that. Now it's used against environmental activists. Public nuisance has become the go-to power for the police, partly because, or at least the one to threaten, because people don't know what it is. Public nuisance can mean all kinds of different things, and certainly if you're a campaigner, you don't expect to know the law around this. And certainly because if prosecutions arise from that, the likelihood is that they will be, the consequences of that are more severe, because the punishment's more severe. So you can hold people on remand, you can put in restrictive bail conditions on people and so on. The new definition of serious disruption means that there are going to be certain people that are going to be targeted. And I have to emphasise it's not everybody. It's likely to be a few key organisers who are going to be targeted for serious disruption prevention orders. This is a kind of banning order that will restrict people from being able to attend protests, gather with protests, influence people to go on protest online, and may potentially end up with them being given an electronic tag to monitor them. We suspect also that this will be a justification for the increased use of live facial recognition, because that is a way of people, that doesn't test everybody. There's a little watch list of people they're looking for, and obviously those are the sort of people that are going to end up on that list. The much bigger power, and I've emphasised this hasn't come in yet, so they're still waiting on this. The much bigger, the power that's likely to affect much more people, and it's something we're at Netpol talking about in preparation for the dicey arms fair that's coming up in London in September, is a new power to stop and search people on the basis that they may be going equipped for disruption. And the reason why that's likely to affect more people is because stop and search is like a really common power. It's one that every police officer knows how to use, right? They haven't quite introduced it yet, but we're expecting that might happen, that could happen in time, and certainly may happen before dicey occurs.